going to bring this initial phase to an end. We've gotten to the first century. So I'd like to take a few minutes and summarize where we are. The objective, remember, of the first part of this was just to try and get as clear a profile as possible of what it was like to be a Jewish boy or man living in the first century. The objective is to take that silhouette and try and get at least a little bit of an understanding of what Jesus was like, in as much as he shared all of that stuff with his contemporaries. So the first part of this today is going to be kind of a summing up. If you guys can think of anything else to add to this that stood out to you, raise your hand and tell me, and I'll write it up there. But as I was thinking through the stuff that we had been talking about, this is what I thought we could say. First of all, regarding Israel's story, we noticed that beginning with the Exodus, there were a variety of things that I guess all Israelites were sort of banking on and shared. They had a variety of hopes, dreams, promises, and heartaches from the wonderful experiences of the Exodus and the deliverance from bondage, the experience of the giving of the Torah, the privilege of the temple and the priestly ministry, the sacrifices, hopes, dreams, promises, and also heartaches. Most of the things that you could say about their story is very nationalistic, right? And that's kind of worth remembering, that what it meant to them to be a Jew was that they were Jewish, and they shared all these things with their Jewish brethren. So a lot of their joy and history was just a part of the fact that they were Jewish by birth. They were children of Abraham. As opposed to all the other nations of the earth. They were the elect. They were the elect people. God chose them to call his firstborn son. And all the promises that were being given into the historical experience of human beings then were done through the channel of Israel, through their prophets, through their holy men, through their kings. It's very nationalistic. We're not there, you and me. We're Gentiles. We're on the outside. The messianic hopes that they had, and this you'll be able to see in the Gospels, the messianic hopes that they were entertaining and that filled them with hope and energy, were monarchical, for one thing. Think of the titles that are used when they're thinking about this messianic figure and they're applying them to Jesus. Son of David, the Davidic monarchy. Messiah, which means anointed one, another reference to the King of Israel. Son of God, which is a direct reference to the Davidic covenant, where God said, "The king will be a son to me, and I will be a father to him." King of Israel, was written over the cross. when Jesus was crucified. And kingdom, a term, a word, kingdom, that has inescapable political dimensions. And it's one of the most frequent words that Jesus used, kingdom. It was kingdom of God that he talked about. And he used the kingdom, the notion of the kingdom, in a much broader sense, but that's beside the point. In the book of Acts, after Jesus was resurrected from the dead and his disciples were reunited with him, they asked him, "Is it at this time that you're restoring the kingdom to Israel?" Once again, nationalistic, monarchical, territorial, geographical, political thoughts and things. Their messianic hopes were also priestly in nature. Remember, the two sort of leading groups in Israel was the monarchy, the king, and the religious leaders, the priests. The chief priest, or the high priest, there was only one high priest in Israel. In fact, in the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Jewish literature from Qumran, we have several places in the Dead Sea Scrolls where they actually refer to expecting two messiahs. One was going to be a king, one was going to be a priest. Two messiahs. And the book of Hebrews in the New Testament, in fact, talks about Jesus and his high priesthood. Just another early Christian development of this messianic hope. So, this is their story. Then the exile happens, and Israel, as a nation, seems to lose everything. They lose their land, they lose their leader, they lose their holy city, they lose the temple, they lose the priesthood, they lose the sacrifices, they lose a place of worship. They lose everything. It was an enormous spiritual tragedy for them. That it's hard for me to tell you what it must have been like for them, except for me to tell you. Think about what it must have been like for them. Read Jeremiah, the weeping prophet. Read the book of Lamentations. Read some of the exilic psalms where they're asking, "Do you hear us? What did we do? Why did you do this to us? Where is Yahweh?" Is the God of the Babylonians greater than the God of Israel? This was tragic. This was a foundational crumbling of everything that you see here. So the exile was tragic. And one can almost expect that the exile would be sort of a watershed event for the Israelites. And in my class in comparative religions, I go into a lot more detail about what happens to the Jews during the exile in a discussion of Judaism. This period of the exile begins a period that has been called Israel and the Nations, because Israel is now subservient to different nations. They don't rule themselves. They're not self-governing. They owe taxes to another lord, whether it's Babylon or Persia or Greece or Rome. This period of Israel and the nations. There was a brief respite from this subservience during the Maccabean revolt, and the Hasmonean dynasty lasted around 100 years. Just a very brief respite when Israel was once again independent and self-governing. This happened until Rome came in and took their turn. Finally, Rome destroyed most of Palestine in AD 70, again in AD 135, and Israel wasn't a state, an independent state again until 1945. in the 20th century. So think about what this must have meant for a people to have lost all of this that pretty much defined their significance to them. That's the tragedy. During this Maccabean period, and the value for us of the Maccabean period, the Hasmonean dynasty, this period that we read about in 1st and 2nd Maccabees, the real value of it for us, I mean, you can read history and get all kinds of insight from historical texts, depending on the kinds of things you're looking for, the questions you ask, okay? And I want you to think now. Think about, what did we learn about the people during this Maccabean period? What sort of rose to the surface as being ultimately important for them? There's a variety of things when you read 1st and 2nd Maccabees. A variety of things come, and I just sat down for an hour this morning and I just started listing a few of the things that I could remember. Sacred traditions. Remember the story that I read to you about the mother and her 7 sons? What was so important to them? Faithfulness. Faithfulness. Preservation of sacred traditions. Faithfulness to death. This wasn't just something they hoped for, this was something they died for. The Jewish self-understanding of these people was that their life, these things in their life, meant everything to them. Torah. You know that Antiochus IV, who sort of started this whole thing, he was the Syrian ruler who made it against the law for them to be Jewish. If you were a mother with a child and you had him circumcised, you'd both be killed. I mean, you can't get much harder than that. Antiochus IV was called Epiphanes, illustrious one. I think I told you that. But the Jews had another name for him, sort of similar to Epiphanes, but it was Epimanes. Antiochus Epimanes. As you can guess, people in antiquity like to play with words and the meanings of words. And we're going to see it even in the New Testament. Epimanes means madman. He's not the illustrious one. He's insane. He destroyed copies of the Torah that he could get a hold of. The language was important to them. Their language. Remember we talked about Hellenization, how Hellenization began with Alexander the Great? And one of the features of Hellenization was that Greek became sort of the lingua franca, the common language of Hellenistic world. So that sort of like English has, sort of become the language of commerce in the world today. And there's every reason to believe that Jews who grew up in Judea during the time of Jesus or in Galilee, they could speak Greek. I can't prove it, but I'm willing to bet Jesus spoke Greek. A lot of his teaching was done in Aramaic, maybe all of it, but he spoke Greek. I think some of his teachings were done in Greek. In fact, some of his parables, if you take the parables and you look at them in the Greek language, they're filled with alliteration, which means words that start with the same letters or the same sequence of letters. Alliteration. It was just a stylistic feature of Jewish rabbis to use alliteration. but it's unusual to find alliteration in the Greek text. I mean, if he told the parable in Aramaic, and then it was translated into Greek, you would think the alliteration would be lost in translation, unless it was a really good translator and he was trying to preserve the alliteration, okay? And maybe that happened. But I think there's evidence to show that Jesus did do teaching in Greek. Anyway, yes, do you have a question?
About that, do you think of can you think of off the top of your head a verse that might have, said that you might have, not we should say he spoke Greek, but led you to think that he believed that he spoke Greek?
Well, the alliteration in the parables, that's one thing. It would be hard to preserve that in translation from Aramaic to... There's another one, John chapter 3, when Jesus has a conversation with Nicodemus, and Jesus says, "You must be born from above." The Greek word "from above" can be translated "from above" or "again." That kind of mix-up in meaning wouldn't happen if it was in Aramaic. But it happened, and I think it only happened because Jesus said it in Greek. Jesus says, "You must be born from above." Nicodemus thought, "You must be born again." Okay? And he says, "How can a man be born again?" And the point Jesus was making isn't that you must be born again. It's that you must be born from above. Okay? In a sense, that's being born again, but that's not the point. The point is you must be born from above, from the Spirit. And that only happened in Greek, the Greek word, okay? That's evidence. Maybe not conclusive evidence, but that isn't the main point I'm trying to make here. I guess the main point I want to make is that the Greek language had permeated that area. By the time Jesus was born, the Greek language had been used in that area for 300 years. But in the Maccabean texts, remember the conversation that the mother was having with their sons? Do you remember? There was a point being made frequently that they were speaking to each other in their own tongue. Even when one of the Syrian soldiers would ask them a question, one of the sons would reply in his own language, in his own tongue. There must have been something about that. This is my language. I'm going to use my language. Their language was very much a part of who they were. The temple. That really is what started it all when Antiochus IV came in and desecrated the temple and set up a statue of Zeus in it. And Hanukkah, which is one of the religious festival that emerges from the Maccabean period, was a celebration of the rededication of the temple. They got the temple back and re-cleansed it. The temple was important. Clean and unclean. Remember that? The story of Mattathias, the father of the Maccabee boys, remember? The 5 sons? The father. That whole thing started because the Syrian soldiers were trying to force the Jews to sacrifice and eat pig, swine flesh. It was an unclean animal to the Jews. Anyway, you can read through Maccabees and some of these things rise to the surface. You see what some of these issues were. Okay? Very, very important issues, especially because some of these issues just continue. They're there even in the first century with the life of Jesus in the early church. They're still there, these issues. They're still there. You know that the early church, all of the New Testament was written in Greek? It was all written in Greek. You know, in Acts chapter 10, Peter had a dream, and in this dream, he was hungry. It was about lunchtime, so he was probably dreaming about food. But he was dreaming about unclean food. This sheet came down out of heaven, and on it there was all this unclean, creepy, crawly things going all over. And then there was a voice that said to him, Peter, get up and eat. And Peter said, no. No way. He thought this was a test. And he was responding to it as a test of his faithfulness. And he says, you know I have never eaten anything unclean. Whoa. You know I have never eaten anything unclean. That takes us back, doesn't it, to some of this? Peter was a good Jewish boy. But then the voice said, no, seriously, Peter, eat. And he said again, no, seriously, no. He was going to be faithful. This was a test of his faithfulness. This is how he was responding. Then finally the voice said, Peter, what God has declared clean is no longer unclean. And then the dream snapped. Okay? Peter woke up and he's like, whoa, what did that mean? Do you guys remember this story? This is critical. This is really critical. Because then there was a knock at the door. And there were some Gentiles at the door. Because at the same time that Peter was having the dream and, going through the stuff that he was going through, there was another activity taking place. A Gentile was being instructed by an angel to go find Peter. Peter was going to be led down to that person's house and tell them about Jesus. These guys got to the door, they knocked on the door, and they said, we're here to find Peter, and an angel sent us here, and blah, blah, blah. And Peter said, well, okay, I'll go with you. So he went with them. He went down to their house, several miles, 6, 7 miles away. They went down to that house, and Cornelius, the owner of that house, who was a Roman centurion, he said, are you Peter? And Peter said, yeah. And he said, well, I was told to talk to you, that you had something to tell me. An angel of God told me this. Now, he was a God-fearer. He was a righteous man, done many things for the Jews. So Peter told him about Jesus, and right in front of his eyes, right in front of Peter's eyes, the Holy Spirit fell on these people. This was the first time that the gospel was preached to the Gentiles. And it happens in Acts chapter 10. In order to get Peter to do it, God had to put his arm behind his back and twist it and say, Peter, clean, unclean, no more. Okay? Gentiles are okay. Go talk to them. This is really cool because in Acts chapter 11, Peter goes back and the disciples heard what he did. So you talk about, being on the hot seat. They heard what Peter did, and they said, Peter, what's up? What's up with this? You talking to Gentiles. You even ate with them. What's going on? What's happening to you? Any of this, do you guys see? This is a lot like what was causing problems here. And here it's happening in the Christian church among the followers of Jesus. That's what really strikes me when I read this story. When I think of how many Jews died over these issues, then I read in Acts chapter 10 and 11 that it took some coercion and some convincing, but eventually the disciples took the message to the Gentiles who were unclean. And the Spirit fell on them just like He did on them at the beginning. Clean and unclean. Eventually, in Acts chapter 10 and 11, the line between these is going to be erased. But this happened in the Christian church. I guess sometimes I feel like it's not really too hard to understand why pious, faithful Jews towards the end of the first century eventually broke with the followers of Jesus completely because of what they were doing. It's not hard for me to imagine why. Because about 250 years earlier, it happened. So anyway. During this Maccabean revolt, the Hasmonean dynasty, we had the emergence of the Jewish sects, and we talked about them last week. There's one thing about the sects, you look closely at these Jewish sects, which, the Jewish sects finally emerge after 8 centuries of the Jews mixing up with the nations. Okay? And what you find in them is you find reflected different levels and degrees of contact, religious, ideological, and philosophical, with the nations. I kind of hinted at that, or wanted to point it out to you when I described the differences between the Sadducees, the Pharisees, and the Essenes. Remember? The Essenes, there's no evidence in the Essene literature that they believed in a resurrection from the dead. And the Sadducees certainly didn't believe it, but the Pharisees did. Where'd that come from? The Sadducees are arguably the most pure Jews, preserving the purity of the Mosaic traditions. Maybe they weren't the best people, but their traditions in this regard were the most pure. In Qumran, there's a kind of a dualism between body and spirit, very Greek-like, very much like we find in some of the Greek literature going back to Plato in the 4th century BC. Plato and the Greeks would have laughed at notions of the resurrection. So where did the ideas about the resurrection come? Well, we find during the period of the exile, we find people believing in the resurrection. They were Persians. The religion that affirms resurrection in addition to post-exilic Jews is the Zoroastrian religion. We still have Zoroastrians alive today. It's one of the living religions of today. So the sects reflect different levels and degrees of contact with the nations, and not everything about the differences between these sects reflects a hostility to the nations. Now, they were very hostile about some things, okay? Remember? These provoked hostility, even martyrdom, but not all of the contact that the Jews had with these nations was that way. Then we looked at Jesus. What does Jesus look like when we have these examples of diversity among these religious Jews in the 1st century? What does he look like? And some of you said the Essenes, and I tried to make a case that he looked like a lot like the Pharisees. And in fact, his frequent discourse with the Pharisees was not sociologically, it wasn't a conflict between us and them, it was more of an us-us conflict, an in-house debate. Jesus never is called a Pharisee. I don't think he was a member of the Pharisaic party. But you've got to admit that they were an awful lot alike when it came to the details of their belief system. But there was one really big difference between Jesus and the Pharisees. And this is where Jesus continually hammers at these guys. And I wanted to say this last time, but I'll have to say it now. What is the big difference between the Pharisees? Okay, we can say, well, Jesus looks a lot like a Pharisee, okay? But how doesn't he look like a Pharisee? What's the difference between them? And the difference between him and the Pharisees is over this, as far as I can tell, is over this issue of clean, unclean. I don't know how much you know about the Pharisees. The Pharisees weren't actually members of the priestly line. They weren't priests. They couldn't hold a priestly office. They couldn't perform sacrifices in the temple. Okay? They weren't from the right tribe. But they thought that all of the requirements made of the priests should be required of every Israelite. In other words, they didn't think that there should be two standards of holiness, one for the priests, one for the rest of us. They thought, if this is the way the priests should live, this is the way we should live. And so the Pharisees typically applied the standards of holiness that were expected of the priesthood. They applied it and expected it of all Israelites. So they intensified the demands of holiness, righteousness. Back to this thing about holiness. The interesting thing about the Pharisees, and Jesus, in fact, tells some parables that nails them on this issue. Did you know, for example, that the Pharisees felt that if my shadow, I don't see a shadow, not enough direct light here. If my shadow, let's say there was a dead body right there. And of course, if I touch the dead body is going to leave me unclean. And then I have to go through ritual procedures to be clean again. It takes 7 days, blah, 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 and all this stuff I have to do. But a Pharisee thought that if your shadow actually touched the corpse, it would leave you unclean. These guys were paranoid about staying clean. They were afraid of just about everything. Did you know that in the Mishnah, which is, remember what the Mishnah was? The oral Torah that was committed to writing in the end of the second, beginning of the 3rd century. We find out that there were different parties of the Pharisees, different groups of the Pharisees. There was one group that they called the stumbling Pharisees. This is funny. The stumbling Pharisees. These guys wore a cloak over their face to keep them from seeing a woman and lusting after her. So they were constantly running into stuff. Stumbling Pharisees. They were afraid that something was going to make them unclean. So they were very strident in the protection of their own cleanness. Okay? In fact, the Pharisees were so defensive in protecting their own cleanness that they hurt people in the process. They hurt people in the process of trying to maintain their own purity. You want to know something? That really made Jesus mad. You want to know, if Jesus came in today, I don't want to put words in his mouth, but I could almost guarantee you that if you hurt other people in the name of religion, in the name of devotion to him, in the name of holiness, he would not like that at all. Don't you dare hurt somebody in his name. This was an issue that he took with the Pharisees. They put themselves and their purity over other people. They were very defensive about it. Jesus, it's like night and day different. Jesus was offensive. Okay, so the Pharisees thought that they could lose their cleanness by contracting uncleanness from somebody else. Jesus was exactly the opposite. He was giving away his cleanness by coming into contact with unclean people. You see the difference? So it's very telling when we see Jesus perform miracles and healings, when he actually will go up to a leper and touch them. He didn't have to, did he? I mean, he could heal somebody without touching them, but he touched them. And in the Gospel of Mark, it's amazing how often Mark points out this little detail, that Jesus touches these people. He touches them. They're unclean. You know what can happen? Don't touch them. They'll leave you unclean. But that's exactly what Jesus objects to. He says, no, I don't get unclean from them. They get clean from me. So he touches them. He eats with sinners. Why? Because he's making them clean. They're not making him unclean. He's making them clean. He was infectious with his cleanness. That's what he taught his disciples to do. That's the way we should be. He gives holiness away. He doesn't put his own at risk. It's the big difference between them. I have 40 minutes left, and I forgot my notes for the next lecture, so I'm going to wing it. If you have your course pack, fortunately for me, I have a lot of the material that I wanted to cover in notes for you in the course pack. So open your course pack to page 14. The title of my page number thingy on my computer didn't work. So I've got like 10 pages that have the number 1 on it. I just left the second number off. So it's page 1, but it's about the 4th one with page 1 on it. And it's titled The Evolution of Modern Gospel Studies and the Quests of the Historical Jesus. So while you're finding that, I'll erase this stuff. You might want to start bringing your course pack to lecture. I'm going to use it a lot. I've got a lot of notes in the course pack that I use for lecture. The second phase of our study is an examination of the primary Christian sources from which we get information about Jesus. And that's Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, plus a couple other early Christian Gospels. So we're moving in now to the Gospels, Introduction to the Gospels phase of the class. In the last 200 years, the study of the Gospels has sort of been a hotbed of scholarly controversy, theological controversy. And a good example is, I'm going to talk about historical criticism first, but a good example is, maybe you've heard of this guy, Albert Schweitzer. Albert Schweitzer wrote a book at the end of the 19th century. It was a dissertation that he wrote to get a Doctor of Theology degree. He also was a medical doctor, so he got a Doctor of Medicine degree, and he was also symphony composer, so he had a Doctor of Music degree. The guy had 3 doctorates. He ended up being a missionary doctor in Africa and winning the Nobel Peace Prize. Have you heard of Albert Schweitzer? Quite an accomplished guy. Anyway, his book, dissertation that he wrote at the end of the 19th century, it was translated into English, and it was called The Quest of the Historical Jesus. And what Schweitzer did was, it was a gigantic task that he set for himself. But his goal in this dissertation was to review all of the historical studies of the life of Jesus that were written during the 19th century. And if you're familiar at all with this, you know that beginning around the end of the 18th century, starting in the 19th century, historical criticism was beginning to be applied to the Bible, to the sacred texts of the Christian church. Now, historical criticism actually started in the Enlightenment, but it took a long time for historical critics, scholars, to actually start applying their methods to the Bible. And when they started to do that, even, there was a tremendous controversy. The church had a lot of power in the universities. And a lot of guys, after they wrote their book, they lost their jobs. So there was potentially a great risk at writing one of these books. And let's just call them Lives of Jesus. There were hundreds of these lives of Jesus that were written during the 19th century in German, French, English, and Latin. Latin was just becoming extinct as a scholarly language, but you see, scholars used to write everything in Latin. It was becoming less and less the thing to do by the end of the 18th century. But he still read a couple of them in Latin. So he read all of these, and these weren't like 50-page books, okay? These were like, some of them were like 4 volumes, 800 pages per volume. So they were multi-volumed, thousands of pages. Thousands and thousands of pages. I have heard stories about what Schweitzer's study looked like when he was in the middle of doing this research. And I guess it looked like a hurricane had gone through his house. He had stacks of books everywhere. And his goal was just to review them, to make and to write a summary, to make it a manageable for someone to read his dissertation and sort of get the gist of what all these guys had written for the last 100 years. It was a daunting task. But what he finally concluded was revolutionary in its repercussions. You see, because one of the things that all of these historical critics bragged about or fancied themselves as doing was they fancied themselves as actually doing objective research. And what that meant more than anything else was that they weren't writing their books to please the church. They were writing their books in an attempt to write good history. And over, these historical critics were saying that this had to be done. This is a hard task, but it has to be done because we have heard the church's version of this story for too long. Now it's time for an honest, objective historian to subject these traditions and these manuscripts to the sharp eye of historical criticism and tell you what really happened, what Jesus was really like. And that's what these lives of Jesus were about during the 19th century. Objective history. What was Jesus really like? Schweitzer concluded at the end of his Herculean reading assignment, he concluded that it was a myth that these guys were actually writing objective history. Do you know why? They all thought they were writing objective history, that they were not being controlled by theological constructs, that they weren't trying to protect the sacred traditions of the church, that they weren't trying to please, the Pope or the bishops or anybody else. They were just doing this as a pure academic enterprise. And they were fairly sure that they would finally get a good story about Jesus. Schweitzer said, to the contrary, these critics ended up writing lives describing Jesus as a mirror image of themselves. This blew the scholarly community away. And Albert Schweitzer did such an impeccable, perfect, wonderful job that it was incontestable. He demonstrated it to such a satisfying degree. And guys, it's still in print in English if you want to read the book. It's called The Quest of the Historical Jesus by Albert Schweitzer. I had to read it and take an exam on it before I could begin my doctoral program in New Testament. It's awesome what he did. And he distilled thousands of pages of historical research down to like 300. And he reviewed all of these major historians. And he concluded that the Jesus that they painted portraits of in their historical quest looked a lot like them. What a shockwave that was, that historical critics were actually being guilty of another kind of subjectivism. They weren't trying to please a theological dogma. They weren't trying to dovetail historical inquiry with theological, truth of the church, but they still ended up painting a picture of Jesus that was kind of a mirror reflection of them. What an indictment. It was devastating. It was devastating. So look at this page, historical criticism. In the box, I have this broken down. Let me just go through this with you. The time of historical criticism it was applied to the Gospels and led to the first quest of the historical Jesus, which lasted from 1778 to 1906. 1906 is when Albert Schweitzer finished his book. His book also brought to an end the quest of the historical Jesus. The first quest. They're going to do it again. But it brought the first quest to an end. The rules for historical criticism were that, number one, truth in history is or has to be the same as truth in nature. This definition means that historians who are using the historical critical method would not accept the possibility of the supernatural. In other words, if they couldn't replicate something in a laboratory or in their own experience, they wouldn't allow it as a possible event in antiquity. That's what I mean by truth in history is the same as truth in nature. Number two, sources for ancient history must demonstrate consistency. So whenever we had some sort of a conflict between the early Christian texts, Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, some sort of an inconsistency or a conflict, they would have to discredit one and choose one. Number three, they believed in natural law. One of the doctrines of historical criticism is the primacy of natural law. And that is that there is a cause-effect system in nature. And for every effect, there was a cause. Hence, again, we have, by definition, an exclusion of the supernatural. And so historians believed by doing this, they were doing objective history until their bubble was burst by Albert Schweitzer. The question that drove these guys, that they wanted an answer to, was what really happened? That's all they wanted to know. What really happened? There's good and there's bad things about what they did and what they went about doing and the results of what they did. Let me go through the pro first, the good. The pro is that when historical criticism was finally applied to sacred texts, such as the Bible, a relative freedom from the strictures of dogmatism led to an exercise of greater freedom in reading ancient sacred texts. There was something good about this. It's okay for someone not to be afraid of the Pope or the bishop. There's something good about not having your job depend upon giving the approved answer to a question. It frees you up. In the process of doing what many theologians consider to be a secular, sacrilegious activity, many new things were learned through careful observation and scrutiny. They did. They learned a lot of things. Because they observed a lot of things that they hadn't seen before. Some of the things that they learned were quite by accident, which frequently happens in science. Scientists start doing one thing, and with the hope of solving a particular problem, and a lot of scientific discoveries and a lot of insights are really made by accident. This happened with them as well. The negative side of historical criticism and what they were doing is that the historical critics precluded the supernatural from the realm of possibility. Some feel that this was damning to the entire enterprise since it forced them to create imaginative explanations for alleged miraculous events. In other words, every time a miracle happened, they had to give some other explanation for it because it couldn't have been a miracle. And so, and you can find this in Schweitzer's book, a lot of his book is explaining some of the unbelievable explanations that these historical critics give for the supernatural phenomena that occur in the life of Jesus. It's amazing. It's a good read, guys. Their presupposition also forced them to make harsh judgments on the historicity of events, like the resurrection. They stereotyped the pre-critical period as naive. So these guys were working in what we'll call the critical period. The pre-critical period, which was everybody before them. You know, have you ever noticed that scientists can be very arrogant? As though I'm smart and I'm the first one. Have you ever noticed that? No? It's really pretty true. I mean, you know, what have we done? We've you know, in the life sciences, we have named and given a fancy Latin term and name to every species of living thing, right? I don't know them all. I just know one, and that's Homo sapien. We're Homo sapiens. Okay, so the scientist names himself Homo sapien. Do you know what that means? It means wise human. Isn't that funny? We name ourselves wise. Now you look around. How many wise people do you really see around you? Haven't we done some pretty stupid things? But we call ourselves wise. That's the scientific name for our species. That's funny. In my class on comparative religions, and I'm not the first to do this, but I suggest that we understand ourselves not as Homo sapien, but as Homo religiosus, religious human. Because every place we find human beings, we find religion. The human being is a species on a quest after God. And that's a pretty fair definition of a human being. My dog isn't interested in God. So they stereotype the pre-critical period as naive, irrational, superstitious, and dogmatic. And maybe there's some truth to that, okay? Maybe there's a little bit of truth to that. Though they were certainly correct to say that some, if not many, were blinded by dogma, the stereotype is a harsh judgment on people, many of whom arguably might be superior to them intellectually. Did you know that Plato, and Plato is one of the smarter human beings that have ever lived. I don't know if you've ever read any of Plato. He was a pretty smart guy. Do you know in his book, The Republic, one of the Republic is something that he wrote about what the ideal empire would look like, the ideal organized political civilization of human beings. One of the things for which he felt capital punishment should be reserved for was atheism. That's interesting, isn't it? Plato thought we need to get rid of atheism because that is the height of irrationality. That's interesting. So the aftermath of the historical critical period is that the result of careful scrutiny of Matthew, Mark, and Luke led to questions about their relationship, specifically why they were so similar. This is one of the good things that resulted from what these guys did in the 19th century. They asked questions about why Matthew, Mark, and Luke were so similar, and it was decided that there was a literary relationship between them, and that one of them preceded the other two. The scholars then focused upon determining which of the three was the oldest. So they thought, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, we call them the Synoptic Gospels, right? Because they look so much alike. The scholars and the historical critics in the 19th century said, these books are so much alike, there has to be some sort of a literary relationship between them. One of them preceded the other two and was used by it as a historical source. And so they set out to answer that question, who was first? And that led to the second stage in the history of gospel criticism. The second stage is not historical criticism, but source criticism. Do you guys have form criticism on the next page? Okay, flip it again. These are out of order. Source criticism should be the next page. The definition of source criticism is, it is a comparative analysis of texts to try and determine when sources were used and which documents were the sources. Source criticism had actually been done for centuries, but not with any scientific sophistication. Augustine, for example, suggested that the first gospel of Matthew, Mark, and Luke was Matthew, and Mark and Luke used Matthew. Well, this question was being brought up again as a result of historical critical inquiry. And they weren't quite satisfied with the answer given by Augustine. No single answer to the problem is actually problem-free, but some solutions are a little bit less problematic than others. The time during which source criticism was done was during the 19th century, probably from, let's just say, 1830 to let's see, when? We'll just end it at the same time as historical criticism. 1830 to 1906. Now, just like the historical critics asked what really happened, they sort of had one question that sort of characterized everything they were doing. The one question that source critics asked was, who wrote first? Now, the advantage for them of doing this analysis of Matthew, Mark, and Luke was that it would help them get an answer to this question, so that these guys were still historical critics. They were still interested in this question. They just thought if they could figure out which one of Matthew, Mark, and Luke was the first gospel, they would be that much closer to the historical Jesus. Okay? They wanted to know which one was oldest. Old is good for a historical critic. They want the earliest possible text of an event. Okay? So their question was, who wrote first? The good thing about this discipline was that their investigations alerted them to order, process, and tendency in the composition of the Gospels. It also forced them to focus upon small pieces of text. They called these pericopes. You can call them paragraphs. Pericope just means cut around. So it focused them to look at small pieces of text and units. When they examined Matthew, Mark, and Luke side by side, have I shown you guys this chart before? Well, they noticed when they examined Matthew, Mark, and Luke that certain patterns just emerged. And so they started keeping track of these patterns. And one of the patterns was that sometimes they would find a pericope, or an event or an episode, in all three Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. That was pattern number one. The second pattern is sometimes they would find material in Matthew and Mark, but not in Luke. The third pattern was sometimes they would find stuff in Luke and Mark, but not Matthew. The fourth pattern, sometimes they would find stuff in Matthew and Luke, but not in Mark. And then the last three, number 5, sometimes they found stuff in Matthew that wasn't in Mark or Luke. Sometimes they found stuff in Mark that wasn't in Matthew or Luke. And sometimes they found stuff in Luke that wasn't in Mark or Matthew. I should point out, though, that this category right here, number 6, where stuff from Mark is found that isn't in Matthew and Luke, it's infinitesimal, very small. Whereas this collection right here of stuff that's only in Luke, this is fairly large. The whole birth narrative in Luke is only in Luke. Luke chapter 24, the resurrection appearances, that's only in Luke. There's one section in Luke, 90 verses long, that's only in Luke. Then there's another section that's over 200 verses long. It's only in Luke. Luke has huge chunks of material that can only be found in his gospel. And you guys are going to find some of that because you have to do a report on Luke's parables. You have to find the parables that only Luke has. And you have to do the same thing with Matthew. Matthew also has a section, quite a large section, of just his stuff. But this is very small. So they looked at this and they said, you know what? This is interesting. What's What's interesting here is that in these first three patterns, the common denominator of them is Mark. Mark is in all three of those. In fact, if you went and you listed all of the material in these first three patterns, you would have 97% of Mark. 97%. That means if we didn't have Mark, we'd still have Mark. Well, except for this. I'll talk to you in a few minutes about some of the stuff in this little group. So scholars thought it looks as though Matthew and Luke, between the two of them, preserve almost all of Mark. Now think about this for a minute. If Augustine was right, and Matthew is the one who used Mark, pardon me, if Augustine was right and Mark was the one who used Matthew and revised him, can you think of a good reason why Mark would leave out things like the birth story? Because there's no birth story in Mark. How about the Beatitudes? He leaves out the Beatitudes. Why would he do that? How about the Lord's Prayer? He leaves out the Lord's Prayer. How about the resurrection appearances? There's no resurrection appearances in Mark. Matthew has some. Why wouldn't Mark include those? What about the Great Commission? Matthew chapter 28. Would he leave that out? See, you can list these things, all of the reasons that together explain why Matthew was the most popular gospel in the early church. For those reasons. The birth narrative is beautiful. The Beatitudes. The Sermon on the Mount is beautiful. The Lord's Prayer. The Great Commission. It's a beautiful text. Why would Mark leave that out? Did he just do a bad job? Or maybe Mark didn't use Matthew. Maybe Matthew used Mark. Now, if you look at the stuff that Matthew and Luke left out of Mark, of theirs, it's kind of interesting. There's a reasonable explanation at our fingertips for the way that they select or selectively excluded material. For example, one of the pieces of information that they left out is 2 verses from the Garden of Gethsemane, Mark chapter 14, verses 51 and 52. The story of the arrest of Jesus and the coming death, the story is reaching a dramatic climax in Mark. They're in the garden. They've just had the Last Supper. The soldiers come in. Judas is betraying Jesus. And then right in the middle of all of this high drama, Mark places these 2 verses. Let me read them to you. Then a certain young man was following him, wearing nothing but a linen sheet over his naked body, and they seized him. But he left the linen sheet behind and escaped naked. Doesn't give a name to this young man. He doesn't appear before that. He doesn't appear after that. The young man running away naked. Who is that? Why is that there? It's not clear why, okay? It makes no contribution to the story of the arrest in Gethsemane at all. The guy has no name. He appears out of nowhere. The only person that knows he's there is the soldier who's left holding his pajamas, and he's gone again. Matthew left that out. So did Luke. They leave those 2 verses out. Here's another one that they left out. Mark chapter 8, verse 22. And they came to Bethsaida, and they brought a blind man to him and entreated him to touch him. And taking the blind man by the hand, he brought him out of the village. And after spitting on his eyes and laying his hands upon him, he asked him, "Do you see anything?" The man looked up and he said, "I see men, for I am seeing trees. They are walking about." Then again he laid his hands upon his eyes, and he looked intently, and his sight was restored, and he began to see everything clearly. Then Jesus sent him home, saying, "Do not even enter the village." This is the 2-try miracle. It took Jesus 2 tries to restore this guy's sight. Matthew and Luke leave that out. Now, if you were using Mark, would you have left that out? Takes Jesus 2 tries. Maybe, maybe not, huh? No, you would have left it. You would have left it in. Well, I don't know. I can think of a reason why they might have left it out. Because it looks like Jesus is having trouble performing a miracle. Okay? So anyway, they concluded, based upon their examination of all of this, that Mark was written first. And this was one of the theories that they felt was pretty safely achieved and accomplished using source criticism, and that is that the first gospel written was Mark. It's called Markan priority. Most gospel scholars today, not all of them, most gospel scholars today accept this as a valid conclusion. Okay, we're out of time. We'll finish this up on Tuesday. Have a nice weekend.